In this video, we'll be looking at discussion boards, a tool that predates Web 2.0, but which has much in common with it, and which has evolved alongside Web 2.0. My name is Mark Pegram, and I'll be taking you through the material on discussion boards. In every online video, you'll see a brief notice like this one. It's a reminder that although you can watch the videos as often as you wish and even download them, copyright law prevents us from sharing them with anyone who is not enrolled in this course. Discussion boards are sometimes also known by the longer name asynchronous discussion boards. Asynchronous just means that not everyone has to be online at the same time, unlike synchronous chat, where the expectation is that everyone will be online together. Let's start by looking at an old and fairly simple example of a discussion forum to illustrate the basic principles. This is a discussion that took place in the Student List project designed for learners of English from around the world. We can see here a set of discussion boards to do with culture and society, all set up within the Moodle virtual learning environment. We're going to have a look at topic number 3, customs in my country. You can see that on this discussion board, there are a number of different threads started by different students who've all been anonymized, but each colored block represents a single student. Some of the discussion topics have quite a few replies. So you can see, for example, towards the end, women's name after marriage, there's a discussion thread with 30 postings. We're going to have a look at the one called Japanese is Strange in about the middle of the discussion board. So this discussion began when a Japanese student made a posting saying that he'd seen foreign films making fun of the Japanese custom of bowing, and he was asking others, is this a funny custom? Should I be ashamed of this? Pretty quickly, a couple of other Asian students replied saying, no, look, this is part of your culture, this is part of who you are. But the discussion got even more interesting when other students arrived from elsewhere in the world, from Europe and from other places, and pretty much echoed what the first couple of respondents had said in their comments. Now, what's really interesting about this is that the students are practicing the English language. That's really the purpose of these discussion boards. They're talking about topics that they really want to talk about, and they're having an intercultural experience at the same time. So this is a set of discussion boards which wraps up a whole lot of different purposes at the same time. A simple example, but a very clear illustration of the educational principles that can underpin well-designed discussion boards. At the other end of the spectrum, here's a very sophisticated discussion on a discussion board that I used with a group of librarians in a professional development course a number of years ago. So really, discussion boards can be used across the educational spectrum, with students at low levels right through to students at very high levels. They might be postgraduate students, or you might be talking about professional development courses, as in this case. From a theoretical point of view, we can say that there are two really major advantages to discussion forums. The first one is to do with the number of people who can participate in the discussion. I'm going to show you a couple of diagrams. They come from the work of Heckman and Anabi from quite a few years ago now. And what they've done here is to map the interactions which are typical of a face-to-face class. So here, the teacher talks, a student replies. The teacher talks, a student replies. We've all come across that pattern before. But Heckman and Anabi then went on to look at the same class when they went into a discussion forum. Here's what they found. Suddenly, the discussion became much more democratic and much more multi-directional. So the teacher might start the conversation, but students can then talk to each other, they can reply to the teacher, the conversation can go off in lots of different directions, and everyone can say as much as they want to say, and they can focus on the areas of the discussion that are of most interest to them. Another very big difference when it comes to asynchronous online discussion as compared to regular face-to-face discussion is that it tends to be very sophisticated, and this has been found in a lot of different studies. The reason for this seems to be that we get the interactional and reflective aspects of language combined together. In other words, there's interaction going on, just like in a conversation, so you can bounce your ideas off other people. But at the same time, that conversation is happening in writing. That really slows things down. It gives you time to think about what other people have said. It gives you time to think about your own responses before you post them. And the end result tends to be a pretty sophisticated level of discussion. All right, let's have a look at a few examples of the kinds of things that teachers do with discussion forums or discussion boards. This is really just to give you an idea of the range of possibilities. Remember, you can pause the video as often as you want if you want to look at any of these examples more closely. You can also find lots of them, and indeed a lot more examples, on the eLanguage Wiki, and I'll give you the address at the end of this video. So here's a Japanese teacher who got her students to have simple conversations in Japanese. They were allowed to use some English if there were words or expressions they didn't know, but the idea was for them to say as much as possible in Japanese. And as you can see, partway down the discussion board, she would come into the conversation from time to time and pick up on different elements of their language. So really this was a fluency exercise for the students, but she injected a focus on accuracy. This is a discussion board set up by an electronics teacher I worked with a few years ago in Singapore. Initially, we weren't sure how well this would work, but in fact, it was a runaway success. What he did was to put a problem, a circuit diagram of some kind, with a couple of possible explanations at the top of a discussion board. The students then had to come along and say which explanation they agreed with and why, and they had to discuss their answers with each other. In fact, he got a lot of discussion because some of these were quite tricky problems. So the students actually really engaged with each other and with the discussion of the problem. And of course, he could always come in at the end and reveal the correct answer. And here's an example of some of the discussion on one particular problem. Remember, as I said before, feel free to pause this video as often as you like. And now for something quite different. This is a primary science teacher, and you can see that she has set up a number of discussion boards at the bottom of the screen. She's given her students a series of tasks. On one of the discussion boards, for example, they have to give their predictions about an experiment. On another discussion board, they have to give their observations. So this is a really good way of keeping track of students' learning and students' reflections as they go through the process of an experiment. With a lot of Web 2.0 and Web 2.0 related tools, it's a matter of thinking a bit laterally. So it might be a matter of thinking of what you can do with a particular tool that is perhaps different from what has been done before and even different from what its designers intended. Sometimes you learn things accidentally, but those things can be very useful educationally. Here's a really good example of this. This is a teacher I worked with in Hong Kong quite a few years ago, a phys ed teacher, and he set up a discussion board for the teacher trainees. They were learning to be phys ed teachers. He was a bit concerned that when they came to their phys ed lessons, they enjoyed them, they participated well, but they didn't think about them afterwards. The purpose of this set of discussion boards was to get the students to think about why they had been asked to do certain things in every lesson. And the discussion boards were very successful from that point of view. But what was unexpected was that students began to reply in whichever language they felt most comfortable with. As this course was running in Hong Kong, the students in some cases had English as a first language, in other cases they had Cantonese and possibly even Mandarin as a first language. And students just moved back and forth on the discussion boards between English and Chinese, depending on what they felt comfortable in writing. Now, because this was not about language, it didn't really matter, and everyone could understand both languages, both English and Chinese, so it worked really well to allow students to express themselves in the language that they chose. When it comes to public discussion boards, it's interesting to note that TED, where you can find a lot of wonderful talks by high-profile people, now has a set of discussion boards. These obviously would be appropriate for students at fairly high levels, but they are a good example of a public discussion board where really interesting topics are being discussed. As of mid-2017, the TED Conversations area was still suspended, while TED reorganizes its conversational format. Hopefully, these conversations will be available again soon, but for now, you can certainly read the archives. In the meantime, you might like to check out the discussion boards associated with organizations like the ones whose names you see on the screen. Many of these have a youth focus, and they're designed to get young people thinking and conversing about key issues in the world today. All right, what about some variations on the basic idea of a text-based discussion board? Here's an example of a very well-known audio discussion board called Voxopop. This is a discussion topic for English learners who are at a very low level. And here's a discussion board for English learners who are at a very high level. In each case, a person can leave an audio recording rather than a text-based message, and others can also respond with audio recording. So it's great for listening practice and speaking practice. And then there are services like Padlet, which has something of a bulletin board format. One of the really good things here is that as the administrator of the board, you can move other people's messages around. So for example, if you get students to brainstorm some ideas, you can later group those ideas in front of the class and discuss the groupings together. That previous example was from an English learning class, but here's an example from a primary science class. And the teacher here has embedded a Padlet discussion board. You'll see the name Wallwisher, that's the old name for Padlet, but she's embedded it within a wiki. And the students have been asked to put up some information about what they know about light. And once all of the students have done that, she'll be able to gather those comments together, group them, and discuss them with the class. What makes Padlet really special is the fact that you can make multimedia postings. Yes, you can post text, but you can also post images, and you can even post videos, as you can see on this discussion board here called Web 2.0 Tools for Teachers. It's a great discussion board, by the way, that you might like to have a look at if you want to explore some other Web 2.0 tools. Padlet can certainly be used at a range of levels for a range of purposes. Here's a Padlet wall created by a Hong Kong teacher I worked with in 2014. She has asked her young students to share the storybooks they've created with the Storybird service, or simply to share comments for Father's Day. And the fathers were asked to come and have a look at this discussion board, and if they wanted, they were able to respond. Or here's an English teacher in Hong Kong who's used Padlet in a very different way. She's placed a Wilfred Owen poem in the middle of the Padlet wall, and students have been asked to add their comments and annotations around the poem. Here's an example where music students have been asked to post recordings of music that they've played, and then to discuss those recordings with their teacher and each other. This is an annotated slide by the teacher talking about the advantages of this kind of discussion of the students' music. Here's another Padlet wall from a very different context. This is from a teacher training seminar I ran in Bangkok in early 2015. It shows the multimodal possibilities of a Padlet wall, where the participants are talking about the value of different digital tools in their various teaching contexts. And finally, here are a couple of discussion boards created by some librarians I worked with in Melbourne. They've asked staff who work on the service desk to indicate what they think are the greatest strengths of the service desk team. And you can see the blue sky metaphor that's been used for the Padlet wall. But then a change was made to a brick wall metaphor when the service desk staff were asked to indicate what the greatest challenges were that they saw for their team. So this was a nice way of collecting both positive and negative comments from the same group of people. And this was done before a face-to-face seminar so that there was material to discuss from the outset. Padlet is not the only discussion board which works in this kind of format and which allows multimedia postings. You might also like to check out this one here called Lino. You might also like to check out this one called Pindax. In this particular case, a kindergarten teacher I worked with in Hong Kong has embedded a Pindax board within a Google site, and she used this to communicate with the parents of her kindergarten children every day, showing them photos, videos, and also text-based descriptions of what the kids had done in class each day, and the parents were invited to respond. So it's a nice way of bringing the parents into their children's educational process. Are there dangers with discussion boards? Well, there are a few risks, as there are with all Web 2.0 tools. Probably the big one you need to think about is called flaming. Flaming is just when one person attacks another person verbally online. Now, in many years of teaching online, I've only seen this happen a few times, and it's always been the result of a misunderstanding. However, it can get out of control fairly quickly and can cause really bad feelings in a class of students. So as a teacher, you need to be on the ball. You need to keep an eye on what is going on discussion boards and indeed in other Web 2.0 forums and on other platforms. A point which has come to my attention a number of times recently is that some users of discussion boards and similar tools feel that they may not always be culturally appropriate. This, for example, is a comment made by a Thai participant in a seminar that I ran in early 2015. She was talking about the fact that it might be difficult to get Asian students from certain societies to discuss material in an online forum. And here's another very different comment, this time from a conference participant in Colombia in South America. But again, like the Thai participant in that seminar, she's talking about the fact that online discussion may not always be entirely appropriate in every culture. These, of course, are considerations that you need to take into account depending on exactly where and when you're teaching. So, pulling all of this together, we can say that the greatest advantage of asynchronous discussion boards is that they allow a combination of interaction and reflection, and that can lead to very sophisticated conversations within a collaborative, constructivist learning environment. They're also a great way of extending the learning community outside the classroom, both in terms of space and time. On the downside, you may need to keep an eye out for flaming, and depending where you're teaching and whom you're teaching, you may need to think about cultural issues. It's also worth remembering that it is very time consuming for both students and staff to have to express everything in writing. And of course, there are some literacy requirements as well. There are potentially many advantages for non-native speakers of English in being able to express themselves in writing, where they can take time to consider what they're saying and how they're saying it. But some students may be put off by the fact that whatever they write is there semi-permanently. So these are all issues to keep in mind if you're planning on using asynchronous discussion boards. If you'd like a summary of the main points covered in this video, as well as links to many of the services we've been talking about, you might like to go to the discussion boards page of the Digital Learning website, which you'll find at the link at the bottom of the screen.